I had been tracking the deer for hours, ever since I fired that shot just after dawn. I was sure I hit him. Clean, too, but he ran. They always run. I followed the blood trail through the dense woods, weaving between pines and oaks, the crisp fall air burning my throat. My rifle hung heavy in my hands as I concentrated on the trail. The blood started as droplets on the leaves, then thickened into larger splotches, leading me deeper and deeper into the woods, farther from where I should have gone. That's when I noticed the vultures. A small group at first, lazily circling above the treetops, a few caws breaking the silence of the woods. It wasn't unusual. They could sense a kill for miles. I figured they'd picked up on the deer's scent. But as I walked further, the number of vultures grew. There were dozens now, maybe more, their dark forms blotting out the pale blue sky. I swallowed hard and quickened my pace. The blood trail grew thicker, smeared across the barks of trees, pooling in spots on the ground. It didn't make sense. No deer could lose that much blood and still be running. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed on, deeper through the woods. I crested a small hill, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It wasn't the deer standing before me. No, it was something much worse. 2 bodies tied to trees. Their arms were wrapped around the trunks, tied behind them with thick, frayed rope. The first body, a man, had his head slumped forward, his chin resting on his chest, blood crusted around his neck and shoulders. His face was somewhat hidden, but I could see enough. His skin was pale, far too pale, like he'd been out here for days, maybe longer. The second body, a woman, was tied to a tree just a few feet away. Her arms were twisted at odd angles, the skin around her wrists raw where the ropes had cut deep. Her head was tilted back, eyes wide open, staring blankly into the sky. My stomach turned, bile rising in the back of my throat. I took a step back, and my foot crunched on the dry leaves. The sound felt too loud, too real, breaking the silence of all that had happened here. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The blood trail I'd been following hadn't belonged to the deer. It had led me here, straight to these bodies. I felt dizzy, the ground beneath me seeming to tilt, and I fought to keep my balance. I was glad for the rifle in my hands, but my fingers felt like jello, like child's hands. I almost dropped it. I turned, wanting to get the hell out of those woods, but as I took another step, I heard something. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and too close for comfort. Someone else was in the woods with me. I froze, straining to listen. The crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs echoed through the trees, coming from behind me. Slow, measured footsteps, as if whoever or whatever was behind me didn't care about being heard. They were coming here with a purpose. I gripped my rifle tighter, my hands slick with sweat. I started to panic. Whoever did this to those people could have been here the whole time, watching me. I spun around, scanning the woods, but all I saw were the shadows between the trees. The vultures continued their lazy circles overhead, unconcerned with what was happening below. My pulse pounded in my ears as the footsteps grew louder and closer. I slipped behind a tree, thankful for my camouflage. Every instinct told me to run, but that would have made too much noise. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. It moved between the trees, just beyond the clearing. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, slipping in and out of the shadows, too fast to follow. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. The silence was unbearable. I turned back to the bodies, their lifeless forms still tied to the trees, and a fresh wave of dread washed over me. What if they had been left here as a warning? What if I was next? I couldn't stay. I needed to leave. With trembling hands, I slowly backed away from the clearing, my eyes darting between the trees, waiting for that figure to reappear. The vultures cawed above me, their harsh cries echoing in the stillness. The woods felt suffocating, the air thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I had to get out. I backed away, staying close to the trees, trying to step lightly on the leaves, hoping whoever was out there preferred me gone. With every breath, every second, I expected a shot to ring out or the person to come running towards me. When I reached the bottom of the small hill, I turned and ran. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of branches, felt amplified, as if the woods were alive, chasing me down. My feet stumbled over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. My own footsteps slammed through the leaves, covering any sound of pursuit. I broke through the tree line, my truck in sight, but my relief was short-lived. As I reached the door and fumbled for my keys, I heard someone moving through the woods behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine came to life, and I tore out of there, dirt and gravel flying behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. But there was nothing. Nothing except the vultures circling above the trees, still waiting for their feast. I had worked as a security guard at the Pines, a 55 and older community near Tampa, for about a year. The job was usually quiet, long, boring hours spent patrolling the neatly manicured lawns, watching the old folks on golf carts buzz back and forth. It was a retirement haven designed to be peaceful. But one night, something happened that shattered the illusion of safety and tranquility in a way I still can't explain. It started on a Friday night. The night was thick with humidity typical for Florida, and the sky was overcast, a blanket of heavy clouds blotting out the stars. I was doing my usual rounds, driving the cart slowly down the winding roads, checking that all the gates were locked, and that no one was wandering around who shouldn't be. At the Pines, most residents didn't stay out past sunset anyway. There were gators in the ponds here, and sometimes they roamed the neighborhood after dark. As I turned the corner by Cypress Lane, I noticed something odd. One of the streetlights was flickering. No, not flickering. It was pulsing rhythmically, like a lighthouse. The houses around it were dark, the residents likely asleep. It was past 11. But something about the light made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I slowed the cart to a stop and stepped out, planning to get a closer look. As I approached the light, I heard something. A low, faint sound, like the hum of insects, but deeper, almost like singing. I looked around, expecting to see some animal rustling in the bushes, but there was nothing, just the soft breeze rustling through the palm trees. I blinked, and that's when I saw it. From out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road directly beneath the pulsing light, was a woman. At first, I thought she was just one of the residents, maybe someone out for a late walk. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. She wasn't moving. Not at all. She was perfectly still, her back turned toward me, her hair long and tangled, falling over a thin white nightgown that looked far too old and worn to belong to any of the residents here. And then, There was her posture. It was unnaturally rigid, as if she was frozen in place. "Ma'am?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response. She didn't even flinch. I took a step closer, the pulsing light above her making everything feel surreal, like I was trapped in a bad dream. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Again, no response. I started to feel that cold, creeping sensation, the kind that crawls up your spine when you know something is horribly wrong, but your brain hasn't caught up yet. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to leave, but I was the guard. This was my job. As I got closer, maybe 10 feet away from her, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Her feet. They weren't touching the ground. She was floating just inches above the asphalt, her toes barely grazing the surface. Every one of my muscles locked. I couldn't move. The air around her seemed wrong. The longer I stared, the more the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just watched in paralyzed horror as the light above her pulsated one last time, and then suddenly it went out. The street was plunged into darkness, but only for a second. When the light came back on, she was facing me. Her face, God, I can still see it now. It wasn't human. Her eyes were empty sockets, gaping holes that seemed to swallow the light. Her mouth was wide open, too wide, stretching impossibly far, as if in a scream. But there was no sound, just that awful hollow blackness where her eyes should have been. Her skin was pale and stretched taut over her bones like dried leather, as if she'd been dead for years. The light pulsed off again, and I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. My legs felt weak, and I could barely keep my balance. When the light pulsed back on, she was gone. The road was empty. The streetlight stayed on, bathing the street in an eerie, steady glow. I stood there panting, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what I'd just seen. But there was no way that was real. It couldn't have been. But the feeling of dread I had was all too real. I ran back to the cart and sped back to the security office, my hands shaking on the wheel. I locked the office door behind me and sat there in the dark, staring at the surveillance monitors, too terrified to look away. I kept expecting to see her face appear on the screen, those empty eyes staring back at me. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? A floating woman with no eyes, no voice, haunting the streets of a retirement community? It sounded insane. But every time I pass that streetlight on Cypress Lane, I feel her heavy, oppressive presence, like something is just out of sight, watching me from the trees, waiting for the right moment to show itself again. It was a normal Tuesday when I received the email from Amy. The request was straightforward. Her daughter, Emma, needed tutoring for her upcoming math exams, and they were looking for a female tutor to make her daughter feel more comfortable. It wasn't an unusual ask. Parents often preferred women tutors, especially for younger girls. The email was polite, maybe a little brief, but nothing that set off any red flags. We planned for me to come to their house at 4 p.m. that Friday. It was in a quiet cul-de-sac in a regular suburban neighborhood. I pulled up to their modest 2-story home, the kind of place that didn't stand out in any way except for a for sale sign out front. Perfectly ordinary, just like her email. When I knocked, the door swung open almost immediately, as if someone had been standing right behind it, waiting for me. A man answered. He wasn't what I was expecting. His clothes were slightly rumpled, and there was something off about his smile. It was too wide, too forced, and his eyes, His eyes didn't match the smile at all. They were cold and calculating. "Hi, I'm here to see Amy and Emma?" "Ah, yes," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm Amy's husband. She's busy with Emma at the moment. They're downstairs. Why don't you come in and make yourself comfortable?" The way he said busy made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. His voice was low and smooth, but there was an edge to it that didn't feel right to me. Something about him felt wrong. I stepped inside. The air in the house was stale, like no one had opened a window in days. The living room was almost empty, with just a folding chair and a table. Sparsely furnished, no personal photos, no signs of a family living there. It was eerie, but I brushed it off. They were selling the house. "So they're downstairs?" I asked, my voice coming out tighter than I intended. He nodded, his grin never faltering. "Yes, the basement." I felt a twinge of anxiety. Why were they in the basement? There had been no mention of that in the emails. Most people welcomed me at the door with their kids, especially for first meetings. Something felt off, and I could feel my discomfort growing. My instincts were starting to scream at me. But maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Amy and Emma were really down there, and I was just overthinking it. He stepped closer, making my skin crawl. "I'll show you the way. They're expecting you." The man turned and started walking toward a door at the far end of the hall, which I assumed led to the basement. But something was nagging at me, tugging at the edge of my mind. I hadn't heard any voices, no sounds of movement from downstairs, no mother, no daughter. The house was unnaturally quiet, like we were the only two people inside. A knot formed in my stomach as he opened the door and motioned for me to go down first. "They're just down there," he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "Emma's shy. She prefers to study in the basement where it's quieter." The alarm bells in my head were blaring now. Everything about this felt wrong. Looking down the stairs, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. There was no light on down there, no noise, nothing. Just the oppressive, looming darkness. I glanced back at him, and that's when I noticed something. His smile had faded, but his eyes, they were focused, sharp, like he was waiting for something. There was no warmth in them, no concern for a daughter or a wife, just anticipation. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "You know what? I just remembered. I left my tablet in the car. Let me grab it. I'll be right back." His face hardened for just a split second. A flicker of something dark crossed his eyes, and my heart pounded. He stepped closer, cutting off my path to the front door. "There's no need for that," he said, his voice lower, more menacing now. "Everything you need is downstairs." My throat tightened. I took a step back, glancing toward the front door, calculating how quickly I could make a run for it. I had no idea what was waiting for me down there, but I wasn't about to find out. The vibe was unmistakable. This was a trap. "I really should go grab it," I said, keeping my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor of fear slipping through. "I won't be long." His smile was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. After a long few seconds, he stepped aside. But something about the way he moved told me he wasn't letting me go that easily. I bolted. My heart pounded in my ears as I raced for the front door, my hand fumbling with the lock. I could feel him behind me, heavy footsteps following. The door finally gave, and I yanked it open, practically throwing myself out onto the porch. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the doors locked, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the doorway, watching me leave. But the door was closed. The house looked just as ordinary as it had when I arrived, except now I knew better. I never went back. Something happened in that last exchange with him. He had sized me up and decided it was better to let me leave. Maybe he knew the element of surprise was gone. I don't know. But to this day, I can't shake the thought that if I had gone into that basement, I wouldn't have come back out. It was just another night unloading shipments at Walmart. Clock in, grab the forklift, and get to work. The truck was late as usual, but I didn't mind. The night shifts were mostly drama-free, even if sometimes they felt a little too quiet in the massive warehouse. When the truck finally rolled in, groaning to a stop under the harsh lights of the loading dock, the driver didn't get out at first, which was weird. Usually, they'd at least nod, maybe make some small talk. But this guy, he just sat there, staring straight ahead before finally opening the door and climbing out. His face was pale, clammy. He handed me the manifest without a word, not even meeting my eyes. I shrugged it off. Everyone has their bad days. I signed off on the paperwork and headed to the back of the truck to get the ramp down. The driver disappeared into the store, and I was alone with the night again. I didn't know then that was the last I would see of him. The trailer door screeched as I rolled it open. Immediately, a thick, pungent smell hit me, the kind that clings to your throat and makes your stomach turn. It was faint at first, like meat had gone bad. I'd dealt with spoiled food in shipments before, but this was different. It was stronger. And the manifest hadn't included food. The forklift was ready, but something in me didn't want to start it. Instead, I decided to step up into the truck and take a look. The first few pallets were fine, just boxes of electronics, all shrink-wrapped and neat. But as I moved further back, the smell grew stronger, and the air felt heavier, almost damp. There was a single pallet wrapped in black plastic toward the back of the truck. It was out of place, unmarked, no labels, no tags. And as I walked toward it, the stench grew unbearable, sour and metallic. I reached for the edge of the plastic, stopping with my hand on it for just a second before I yanked it back. What I saw made my blood freeze. Beneath the plastic, stuffed in among the boxes, were what looked like bags, clear plastic tightly sealed, but what was inside wasn't products. It was flesh. Pieces of it, limbs severed at odd angles as if hacked apart. They were grayish, swollen as if they'd been sitting for too long. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the slick floor of the truck. I wanted to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was more. A face, not whole, but parts of it, a mouth gaping open in a silent scream, eyes glazed over, staring blankly through the plastic, and hair, clumps of it matted with blood. Panic surged through me. My brain couldn't make sense of it. How could this be here? In a regular shipment mixed in with boxes of electronics? I was on autopilot now, backing away, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. That's when I heard it, a soft thud, then another. It came from behind me, inside the truck, further back in the darkness. Someone, something, was moving. I whipped around, but most of the truck was still in shadow, the light from the dock not reaching far enough. My heart was in my throat. Was it the driver? Had someone else gotten in here? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them were good. I couldn't stay here. I bolted for the door, practically throwing myself out of the truck. My hands were shaking so badly that I fumbled the latch as I tried to slam it shut. I could still hear it, that awful thudding, echoing from inside. When the door finally closed with a deafening clang, I stood there for a moment, gasping for air, my back pressed against the cold metal of the truck. I didn't wait. I sprinted to the office, my mind racing, trying to figure out what I'd just seen. There was no explaining it, no way to rationalize the horror that had been hidden in that truck. The police came and found nothing at all alive in that truck. The driver is still missing. I never thought I'd be superstitious. Owning a building like mine in Boston's historic district, you hear all kinds of ghost stories. Most of them are entertaining, even quaint. But the third-floor apartment of my building, that was something different. It was the largest and nicest of the 3 units tucked away at the top, offering privacy and safety since it wasn't a ground-floor unit. You'd think it would be the most desirable, but every time I rented it out, the tenants left within months. They always had the same complaints. Strange smells, loud noises, and worse, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. One tenant, a woman in her 40s, swore the shower turned off every time she tried to bathe. She was gone within 2 weeks. The long-term tenants below on the 2nd floor reported hearing footsteps and scraping furniture late at night, even when the 3rd floor was unoccupied. It became a pattern. People moving out quickly, the complaints stacking up. It wasn't just bad luck anymore. Something was wrong with the unit. I decided to deal with it myself. Maybe all the talk of hauntings and ghosts was just in people's heads, brought on by the creaky old floors or the poor insulation. I thought maybe I could fix it. A little renovation, some fresh paint, and maybe I'd exorcise whatever bad energy lingered. I went up one morning with a bucket of tools, paint cans, and a stepladder, determined to make it right. The 3rd floor apartment was still and quiet, bathed in the weak morning light that filtered through the dusty windows. It was cold, colder than the rest of the building, but I figured the old place's heat was just struggling since it had been off for at least a week. I added the heat to my checklist. I started in the bathroom, where most of the complaints came from. The shower head had been replaced recently, and there was no sign of any plumbing issues. I unscrewed it anyway, just to check for clogs. As I worked, I became aware of a smell. At first, it was faint, like something left out to spoil. But as I worked, it grew stronger, rotten and sickly sweet. It filled the small bathroom, clinging to my clothes and skin. It was like something had died inside the walls. I gagged, dropped my wrench, and backed out into the hallway, my head spinning. I went to open a window, hoping to air it out, but the window wouldn't budge. That was strange. I'd never had trouble opening it before. Then I heard it. Faint at first, like a whisper. A voice. It sounded like it was coming from the pipes, hissing through the walls. It was so low I couldn't make out the words. My pulse quickened. It couldn't be a tenant downstairs. I knew the 2nd floor apartment was empty for the weekend. The whisper grew louder, sharper, as if it were angry. I rushed back into the bathroom, determined to find the source. The air was thick with that rancid smell, and as I stepped inside, I saw something that froze me in place. The shower curtain moved. Not like it was blown by a breeze, but like someone or something was on the other side, slowly dragging their hand along the fabric. The rings rattled, sliding along the rod with a slow, deliberate motion. I didn't breathe. I couldn't. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stepped back, the floorboards creaking beneath me, and the curtain moved again. This time it was pulled open an inch, just enough for me to see inside the tub. There was nothing there. The whispering turned into a low murmur, louder now, as if the walls themselves were alive. It surrounded me, filling my ears until it was unbearable, the words still indistinct, but angry, almost mocking. And then, without warning, the faucet turned on. Ice-cold water gushed from the shower head, splashing against the empty tub. I yelped, stumbling backward, my back hitting the wall. The handle twisted on its own, spinning wildly as if an invisible hand was toying with it. I fumbled for the door, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely grip the knob. I yanked it open and ran into the hallway, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. That smell, like rotting meat, was everywhere now, suffocating me, and the whispering, it was in my head, echoing, no longer confined to the walls. It was a woman's voice, angry, accusing, her words sharp and cutting, but still incomprehensible. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, and burst into the street below, gasping for air. I didn't go back upstairs. I knew, without a doubt, that that third-floor apartment wasn't empty. It had never been empty. That was the last time anyone set foot up there. I locked the door to the third-floor apartment and never opened it again. The smell, the voices, the shower, whatever haunted that place, it could stay locked away. I wasn't going to fight it. Over the years, I found new tenants for the other floors easily enough. And when they asked about the third-floor apartment, I just told them it wasn't for rent. Not anymore. And when they asked why, I would just smile and say, maintenance issues. But I knew better. The third floor wasn't empty. It was waiting. It was a typical night shift, the kind where exhaustion weighed down my limbs and the radio crackled with call after call. The dispatcher's voice broke through the static, sending my partner Jake and me to a small house at the edge of town. The call came in as an unresponsive male, potential overdose. It wasn't uncommon in this part of town, but something about the address made Jake's face go grim. "You good?" I asked, catching the change in his expression. "Yeah," he muttered, staring at the road ahead. "Been here before." The house was run down, paint peeling from the walls and the front yard overgrown with weeds. I could feel the weight of its history as soon as we pulled up, something heavy in the air, like the house had seen too much. We rushed inside, gear in hand, and found the patient slumped on the couch, middle-aged, gaunt, and barely breathing. His skin was pale with a bluish tinge, classic signs of an overdose. Jake ran back to the ambulance for supplies. I knelt next to the man, checking his vitals, trying to keep my own hands steady. His pulse was weak, fading in and out. My training kicked in, automatic, but the place gave me the creeps. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet for a place with so much going wrong. That's when I felt someone watching me. A presence. It started as a slight pressure in the room, like the feeling in the air before a thunderstorm. I glanced up, and that's when I saw her. A woman stood in the corner, partially hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her eyes. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with long dark hair that hung limply around her face. Her clothes were dated, like something from another decade. But the worst part was her expression. Her eyes were wide, wild, and filled with terror. "Hurry!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "You have to save him! Hurry!" Her voice was so loud it reverberated in my skull. I flinched, almost dropping the stethoscope from my hands, my pulse skyrocketing, panic rising like bile in my throat. "I'm doing everything I can," I stammered, my voice shaky. I turned to the woman, confused. "Just give me a second." But she kept screaming, louder and more frantically. Her hands clutched at her hair, pulling as if the sight of all this was driving her mad. "You have to save him. You don't have much time." I froze. My breath caught in my chest, her words, her voice. It was as if she were speaking directly into my mind. She didn't sound like any ordinary person in distress. Her voice was sharp, echoing in ways that gave me goosebumps. Just then, Jake burst back into the room, and I was so relieved. He knelt beside me, and with him there to deal with the woman, I could focus entirely on my task at hand. "Calm her down," I blurted, pointing toward the woman in the corner. "She's losing it." Jake looked up at me, confusion etched across his face. "What?" "The woman, over there," I said, more frantic now, pointing harder. But when I looked back at the corner, the woman was gone. The air felt colder. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, scanning the room. But there was nothing. No one. I could feel my own heart pounding in my ears, my vision tunneling. There was a woman. She was right there, screaming at me. She said to hurry, that I didn't have much time. Jake stared at me, and for a moment I saw something dark pass across his face. "We're alone in here," he said, his voice low. "There's no one else." But there was. I knew what I saw. I could still feel the chill in the air, the sound of her voice echoing in my head like a scream that just wouldn't stop. I stood up with weak knees as Jake worked on the patient, but our patient's breathing remained shallow, his lips turning a deeper shade of blue. "We have to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This place, something's wrong." Jake glanced at me, then at the patient. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Get the stretcher. Let's take him in." As I moved to the door, my mind raced, replaying the image of the woman in the corner. I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't real, not in the way people are. She was something else, something tied to this place. We loaded the patient into the ambulance, but even as we drove to the hospital, I couldn't shake the image of that woman's face, the fear and the desperation. Jake didn't speak much during the ride, and when we finally reached the ER, the doctors took over and we stepped outside to catch our breath. "You okay?" he asked, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "I saw a woman. You said you'd been there before? Who was that woman?" Jake exhaled a long plume of smoke, his eyes dark. "I didn't want to say anything back there," he said, voice low. "The last time I was at that house, we found a girl, overdosed. She didn't make it. She died at that house, in that room." I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. That woman, the one I'd seen, she wasn't alive. She was desperate to save someone from the fate she'd suffered. Jake threw his cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "You look like you saw a ghost back there," he said quietly. I could only nod, because I had, and in my head she was still screaming. I never liked working the night shift at the nursing home. There was something about the way the lights in the long, sterile hallways stretched out, blending with the dark, shadowy spaces where we turned off the lights at night. The place always seemed too quiet and unnaturally still, as if everyone inside had already crossed over but hadn't realized it yet. Tonight was no different. The air felt thick, pressing down on me like the weight of a forgotten memory. I had just finished my rounds, checking in on patients, most of them fast asleep or lost in the fog of medication. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, second by second. Room 219 had always unsettled me. Mrs. Davenport lived there now, an elderly woman in her 80s with a sharp mind but a frail body. She had no family that visited, but she often talked about her daughter. The only problem was that her daughter had been dead for over 10 years. Still, Mrs. Davenport would insist that she saw her, that her daughter came to visit her late at night, sitting by her bedside, watching over her. Tonight, as I passed her room, I paused. The door was cracked open slightly, and a soft glow seeped out into the hallway. I leaned in, listening. There it was, a soft murmuring, too low to make out the words, but unmistakably a conversation. I knocked gently on the door. "Mrs. Davenport?" I called softly, but no one answered. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The small bedside lamp cast a dim glow across the room, illuminating Mrs. Davenport lying motionless in her bed, eyes closed. But the murmuring continued, though now I could hear it more clearly. "Don't worry, I'll come back." It wasn't Mrs. Davenport's voice. It was softer, younger, but chilling in its calmness. I scanned the room, but there was no one there. The chair next to the bed was empty, but the voice persisted, so close it felt like it was right beside me. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I stepped closer to the bed, watching Mrs. Davenport's chest rise and fall slowly with each breath. I told myself she was dreaming, maybe just muttering in her sleep. But then the voice shifted again, more distinct and more urgent. "She's not dreaming. She's waiting." I froze. The sound came from the far corner of the room, where shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, defying the dim lamplight. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, and saw that there was a figure, no, a shape, barely visible, standing in the corner. I blinked, my eyes straining to make sense of what I was seeing. It was like a trick of the light, flickering in and out of existence. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately stepping forward into the light. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. She was tall, her body draped in a long black dress that clung to her loosely. Her face was blurred, like someone had smudged it, erasing the features that should have been there, and yet I could still feel her eyes on me, boring into me, even though I couldn't see them. She tilted her head, as if studying me, then turned her attention to Mrs. Davenport. Slowly she glided toward the bed, her movements too smooth, too quiet. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor as I watched in paralyzed horror. The woman leaned down, her hand hovering over Mrs. Davenport's face, fingers long and thin, like bones stretched too far. She caressed the air above her, whispering something I couldn't understand, something that chilled me to the core. "I'll be back for you," the woman murmured, her voice soft but sharp, like a blade cutting through the quiet. I didn't know if she was talking to me or to Mrs. Davenport. The old woman's eyes opened, and she gasped, her body stiffening, but her gaze wasn't on me. She was staring straight at the figure looming above her. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, as if she was choking on her words. Tears spilled from her eyes, her face twisted in horror. "Please, not yet. Please, not yet." I wanted to grab her and pull her out of the bed, out of this room, away from whatever that was, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped in my own body, forced to watch as the woman leaned closer to Mrs. Davenport, her blurred face hovering inches from hers. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman straightened up and turned to look at me again. The pressure in the room intensified, the air so thick I could barely breathe. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't budge. She didn't say anything this time. She just stared. At least I think she did. And then, without a sound, she began to fade, dissolving back into the shadows of the corner until she was gone and the room felt empty. Mrs. Davenport let out a sob, her whole body trembling violently. I rushed to her side, grabbing her hand, trying to comfort her, but she was inconsolable. "She's gone, but she'll come back. She always comes back." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. All I could think about was that figure, that thing that was supposed to exist but didn't. It had looked right at me, had seen me, and I had seen it. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. No one would believe me anyway. But every time I close my eyes, I can still feel her standing in a corner, waiting for her next visit. It was close to midnight when I stepped into the laundromat. The stifling heat from the dryers, having run all day, welcomed me. It was empty and felt isolated, with only the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, keeping the late shift going. I had always hated doing laundry this late, but my work hours didn't give me much choice. The laundromat was the only place open in the small strip mall at this hour, its windows reflecting the empty parking lot outside. I'd been coming here for months, but tonight felt different. The air was electric, like the whole place was holding its breath. The laundromat was empty except for me and a few rows of machines. The attendant must have been in the back room or stepped out for a minute. I thought it was odd, but dumped my clothes into a washing machine near the back and fed it quarters just the same. I watched the soapy water slosh around behind the glass door as I leaned against the wall checking my phone. The room was silent except for the soft whir of the machine starting up. It was then that I noticed it, the faintest creaking sound. I lifted my head, scanning the laundromat, but there was no one else here. The front door hadn't opened, and no one was in sight. My eyes darted to the far end of the room, where the older, rusting machine stood, unused and caked in dust. The creaking continued. A slow, rhythmic sound like someone gently rocking back and forth on the old, cracked tiles. The sound was low at first, but gradually it grew louder, like it was moving toward me. My throat was dry as I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a pipe in the wall or one of the ancient dryers trying to shake off its rust. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I stared at the row of machines. They were all off except for mine, the others empty and silent. Yet the sound continued, an odd creaking sound I'd never heard here before. I walked over to the dryers, peering through the glass doors, each one showing only an empty black space inside. I stepped closer, almost touching the cold metal when I heard it again, but this time behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. Just the dull hum of the machine and the fluorescence over the linoleum tiles. My eyes scanned the room again. I was alone, I told myself. There's nothing here. But when the sound stopped, I could feel something in the air shift. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath cloud in front of me. The machine was still running, but it was like the room itself had gone silent. I glanced back at my washer, the one I'd loaded just minutes ago. Something was off. The clothes inside were moving too slowly, dragging as if they were weighted down. I stepped closer, dread crawling up my spine. My socks, my shirts, my jeans, they were tangled in with something else. Something that wasn't mine. A dark, sodden mass appeared between the folds of my laundry, pressing against the glass. At first, I thought it was some piece of fabric I'd left in there by mistake, but it wasn't fabric. It was flesh, pale, bloated, and gray. I stumbled back, my body stiff with terror, as I stared at the thing moving inside the machine. It was a hand, a human hand, twisted and contorted, its fingers brushing the glass as it turned with my clothes. The washer door rattled violently, shaking as if something was trying to get out. I backed away with my heart racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned toward the front of the laundromat, thinking I could just bolt for the door, but that's when I saw it in the reflection of the windows. There was movement, just a faint flicker at the corner of my eye. A figure stood at the far end of the laundromat, barely visible in the dim light. At first, it looked like a person, tall and thin, standing unnaturally still. It must be the attendant. I would tell him about the hand. But something was wrong. The figure was swaying, rocking gently from side to side, just like the creaking I had heard earlier. I blinked, and it was closer. My stomach turned. I couldn't make out any features, no face, no details, just the outline of a figure standing in the shadows, moving toward me with each blink of my eyes. Every time I dared to look away, it would appear closer, like it was crawling through the very fabric of reality. A cold, suffocating fear wrapped around me as the figure stopped a few feet away. I could feel its presence bearing down on me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The room seemed to close in on me, and then it spoke. A low, rasping whisper, but the voice came from everywhere at once, reverberating off the machines, off the walls, seeping into my bones. "Not your turn," it said, the voice distorted and dragging like it was coming from underwater. "Not yet." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The washer door rattled again, and then the bloated hand pressed harder against the glass, fingers twitching. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting, as if daring me to make a move. In one final desperate act, I forced myself to turn away toward the exit. My legs felt like they would give out, but I pushed through the fear, lunging toward the door with all the strength I had left. As I burst outside into the night, the oppressive weight lifted. The cool air hit my face, and I collapsed against the side of the building, gasping for breath. When I looked back through the laundromat window, it was empty. The figure was gone. But the washer, it was still running, and inside that hand was still there. I transferred to the university in the middle of the semester, so by the time I arrived, most dorms were already filled. They put me in the oldest building on campus that nobody wanted, the kind with creaky wooden floors and drafty windows. My room was a single, on the top floor at the very end of the hall, isolated, away from most of the other students. I didn't mind at first. I thought I'd appreciate the quiet. The first night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of someone walking outside my door. At first, I assumed it was just someone coming back late, but the footsteps didn't fade away down the hall. They stayed, slowly going back and forth, for what felt like hours. When I finally got up the courage to check, the hall was empty. Not a single sound, just the old flickering light buzzing overhead. I brushed it off as nerves from starting somewhere new, but the next few nights it only got worse. Every night around the same time I'd hear the footsteps again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther down the hall, but always steady and persistent. Then came the whispers. They were faint, like they were being carried by the draft that seeped through the cracks in the window. I couldn't make out any words, but I could tell they weren't friendly. It felt like someone was standing just behind me, leaning in, muttering something cruel I wasn't meant to hear. Every time I whipped around to check, There was no one there. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping with the light on. It was on a Friday night that things escalated. I had been sitting at my desk with my headphones on, trying to focus on an assignment, when I felt a sharp, cold breeze brush against the back of my neck. I turned, but the window was closed. That's when I noticed it. My door, which should have been locked from the inside, was slowly creeping open. The lock hadn't clicked, and there was no sound of anyone turning the handle. It just drifted open, an inch at a time, until it hung ajar. I stared at it, my breath caught in my throat. I could see out into the hall, which was empty, the light dim and yellow in the distance. But somehow it felt like something was standing there, watching. I got up and shut the door, locking it again. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Nothing. I checked the lock a few times to be sure it was secure. Then I went back to my desk and sat down, trying to convince myself I just hadn't locked it right when I'd come home. But not even 5 minutes later, it happened again. The door creaked open, slower this time. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't move. I just stared at the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I waited for something, anything, to appear in that gap, but it stayed empty. Just that open, empty, silent space. I stood up, ready to slam the door shut again, when I heard it, the faintest whisper right behind me. Come out. It wasn't loud, but it was clear this time. The voice was low, like whoever or whatever was daring me. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out, but I couldn't. Leaving would mean going out into the hallway, exactly what it wanted. The door creaked open wider. I stumbled back toward my bed, grabbing my phone. I didn't know who to call. Campus security? One of my friends? I couldn't even form a coherent thought. My fingers shook as I found my friend's number, praying she'd pick up. As it rang, I heard it again, closer this time. Come out. The voice seemed to echo through the room, though I knew I was alone. I turned, scanning the space, but there was no one there. No one in the hall, no one in the room. Just the growing sense that something was very wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. My call went to voicemail. I cursed under my breath and decided I wasn't staying in that room another minute. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, half expecting something to grab me as I stepped into the hallway. But nothing did. The moment I was out, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I didn't go back that night. I spent the rest of the weekend crashing on a friend's couch, making excuses about the heat being broken in my building. Looking back, I didn't even want to transfer to the school, way before anything weird happened in my dorm. I liked my old school, but it didn't have the same name reputation as the university. My parents convinced me to transfer, since it had a great foreign diplomacy program, which was my chosen major, one of the best in the country. But I regretted it the moment I saw my room. Something about it just felt wrong. It wasn't the size, though it was small and a bit claustrophobic. It was something else. The air always felt thick, even before the whispers, like the walls were holding something in, or like someone had been breathing in there for far too long. The room was always cold, colder than the hallway outside, even though the thermostat was cranked all the way up. Still, it was just a dorm, I told myself, and I had to make the best of it. But another night, I heard something else. A soft tapping, like fingers drumming against the wall. At first, I figured it was just someone in another room, but the tapping kept going, steady and rhythmic, and it felt closer, like it was coming from inside my room. I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. Old buildings, thin walls, pipes settling, normal stuff. But the tapping wouldn't stop. I rolled over, pulling the covers up, and glanced toward my desk. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light from the window. But it wasn't. There was someone sitting in my chair, hunched over like they were waiting for something. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, silent, staring at the floor. I blinked, and it was gone. I forced myself to sit up, squinting through the dim light. The chair was empty. I was alone. I told myself I'd imagined it. I was just tired, stressed from moving and settling in. I knew I was hypervigilant after the door incident, but the feeling didn't go away. The tapping, though quieter, was still there. I kept my head covered and prayed it would go away. At some point I must have fallen asleep, but I woke up exhausted. The next morning I had to tell someone. I asked one of my friends that lived in the next building if he'd ever seen or heard anything in his room. He shook his head and told me I was just adjusting. It was an old campus with old dorms. I wanted to believe him, but the fear stuck to me. A few nights later, it got worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. with that same tapping sound filling the room, louder this time. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. I didn't want to look. Something in me was screaming not to, but I did. The figure was back. This time it was closer, standing beside my bed, leaning over me, still hunched like before, but now its head was tilted slightly. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were locked on me. I couldn't move. My limbs felt like lead. The figure had no face, its edges buzzing like erratic smoke, but I could feel it staring at me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Then, slowly, it raised a hand with a long, stretched, smoky finger over my head. And in the same steady rhythm I'd been hearing for days, it began tapping against the bed frame. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was trying to burrow into my skull. Suddenly, it stopped. The figure straightened, its head snapping upright with a sharp jerk, and it was gone. The room was silent, the air so charged it felt alive. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up, clutching my blanket, horrified it might come back, but it didn't. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, some kind of night terror, but the tapping, that rhythmic tapping, haunted me throughout the day. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that figure standing at the foot of my bed, those fingers drumming against the wood. I thought about moving out, but something held me back. I didn't want to admit I was scared. I didn't want to let whatever it was win. But the nights kept getting worse. The tapping would start as soon as I turned off the lights, and the figure, it got bolder. It didn't just stand at the side of the bed anymore, it moved. Sometimes I would wake up to find it standing inches from my face, that smoky face staring into mine, that hand hovering above my chest like it was waiting to strike. And then one night, it spoke. I don't know if I heard it with my ears, or if it was just in my head, but the words echoed through me like a growl. "You can't leave. You're mine." I bolted upright, now awake and gasping for air, but the figure was gone. The next morning, I packed my things and moved in with one of my friends until the university found me a new room. I didn't care if I had to couch surf for the rest of the semester. I didn't stay there another night. As I left, I stood at the door and looked back inside into the darkness beyond. I swear I saw that figure hunched in the corner, fingers tapping against the wall. If you like these stories, this is the place for you. I cover scary stories about ghosts, cryptids, paranormal events, and disturbing, creepy human encounters. My Etsy store is open if you'd like to support me there. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.